Welcome to this week's edition of Ask an MS Expert. I'm John Strum, and I'm the host of the Real Talk MS podcast. Each week, Real Talk MS reaches thousands of people in more than 100 countries around the world with the news that people affected by MS need to know. My wife, Jean, lived with progressive MS for 23 years, so I've had a front row seat experiencing all the ways that MS can impact a family. Currently, I'm a member of the International Progressive MS Alliance Scientific Steering Committee. I'm a district activist leader and trustee for the National MS Society, and I chair the Society's California Government Relations Advisory Committee. I want to thank you and welcome all of you who are joining us on GoToWebinar, Facebook Live, YouTube Live, and Twitch. The MS Society's Ask an MS Expert webcast is designed to give us a place for the MS community to connect and to connect you with MS experts who are ready to answer your questions on the topics that impact people affected by MS every day. Please feel free to post your comments and questions in the GoToWebinar chat box. MS navigators are online throughout today's program, answering questions and connecting you with resources. Many people living with MS have concerns about the safety of routine vaccinations, and lately those concerns have certainly been extended to the COVID-19 vaccines. Today we'll get a COVID-19 vaccine update, and we'll also learn about Cover MS, an important study that's looking at the effects of the COVID-19 vaccines on people with MS. I'm joined today by two experts, Dr. Amit Bar-Or and Dr. Farren Briggs. Dr. Amit Bar-Or is at the University of Pennsylvania and Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, where he holds the Melissa and Paul Anderson Professorship and Presidential Endowed Chair. He's the chief of the Division of Multiple Sclerosis and Related Disorders, and he also serves as the director of the Center for Neuroinflammation and Experimental Therapeutics. Dr. Bar-Or's clinical focus is on neuroinflammatory disorders, mainly multiple sclerosis, and he runs a cellular and molecular neuroimmunology lab, which focuses on increasing our understanding about the principles of immune regulation, immune neural interactions, and the contributions to inflammation, injury, and repair of the human central nervous system. Dr. Farren Briggs is a multiple sclerosis epidemiologist who's been investigating the factors influencing MS risk, presentation, and progression. He's an assistant professor at my alma mater, Case Western Reserve University, where he teaches epidemiology classes, and he's also a former National MS Society postdoctoral fellow. Dr. Briggs' research spans the MS disease course, including efforts to identify biomarkers to characterizing the impact of other health conditions in those people living with MS. I'd like to welcome Dr. Briggs to join me now, and I want to thank you for joining us today.
John, it is a pleasure to be here with you.
The National MS Society has partnered with iConquer MS in supporting research that's looking at the impacts of COVID-19 vaccines among people living with MS. Dr. Briggs, can you tell us what the COVID-19 Vaccine Response in MS Project, or Cover MS, is and the purpose of the study?
Absolutely, John. So Cover MS is a study funded by the National MS Society and led by iConquer MS under the guidance of a steering committee that is comprised of several individuals with MS, several researchers, as well as representatives from the National MS Society. So this study was launched in March of this year, and it's ongoing. And so there's two parts to this study. The first is to answer the question regarding immediate vaccine reactions in persons with MS. As many of you might know, in most of the clinical trials for the vaccines, individuals with MS, other autoimmune diseases, or individuals on immune modulatory therapies were excluded from these trials. So we actually don't know how vaccines might result in various reactions such as fatigue, headaches within a short period of time after receiving them. So that was our first goal. The second goal, which is ongoing, is to understand if there's differences in MS symptoms after receiving the vaccine. So such as relapse activity, is there an increase in symptoms, And so this is also a longitudinal component of this project as well.
How many participants have you recruited for the study?
So as of this week, we have 1,300 individuals with MS who have registered through iConquer-MS for the Cover MS study. What you see in front of you are actually a first cut analysis of 719 individuals, and this was individuals who registered and provided their information between March through the beginning of June, and so over a 3-month period. And we are hoping that enrollment is ongoing, and so individuals can continue to provide their information as we move forward.
Well, I heard you mention that the study is ongoing. Can you tell us what you've learned so far?
Yes, so there are several things we've learned so far. And so here I just wanted to share about results from an analysis, which is on the next slide, but I will want to describe first who we are studying in this first part of our study. We're looking at primarily women with MS which is representative of the general MS population. We're also looking at individuals based on their DMT status, so which disease modifying therapies they're on. And you see we have a population that's represented by subtype as well as by vaccine type as well. So 60% of our population have had the Pfizer vaccine, about 35% have had Moderna, and so this is generally representative of the general US population as well. And so our key findings so far are that in general, individuals with MS, compared to the results from the 4 vaccine trials, do not seem to have more reactions at all after their first and second vaccine shot. So what I have here on this figure, the blue columns are the results, the aggregate results from the 4 major vaccine trials. Pfizer, Moderna, Oxford AstraZeneca, and the Johnson Johnson Janssen vaccine trials. The orange columns are the results from our data set, the Cover MS participants, and the solid bars are reactions after the first dose, and the striped bars are the reactions after the second dose. So as you can see, looking at pain, which is the leftmost set of columns, individuals in the clinical trials experienced much more pain than those who were in the Cover MS study. We can see that pattern sort of persistently continues across several of these other symptoms. The only one where individuals with MS had more symptoms is fever, and that is after the second vaccine. But in general, it seems that individuals with MS have a similar reaction profile to the general population.
How do you see the results of this study benefiting people with MS?
Well, I think the primary goal of these results are to inform individuals who might be vaccine hesitant. And so it's to provide information to sort of prepare individuals for what to expect when receiving this vaccine. And so we can also say we've looked at several other relationships as well. And so the second bullet point here is pretty important, is that individuals on DMTs do not appear to have more severe reactions at all compared to individuals not on DMTs. This is after accounting for age, disease status, subtype, and other factors. We also noticed there were no differences by subtype as well as disease duration. We did note that older individuals and men reported fewer reactions, and this is consistent with the general population. Also consistent with the general population is that individuals with a prior COVID-19 infection reported more reactions after the first dose only, not after the second dose. And if you had a reaction after the first dose, you were also more likely to report a reaction after the second dose as well. And so this would hopefully guide individuals as they prepare or consider other options such as booster shots moving forward, as so far it seems that individuals with MS have reaction profiles similar to those reported in the general population.
I understand that you're still recruiting participants for Cover MS. How can someone learn more or get involved?
You can go to the iConquer MS website, or you could do a web search for Cover MS, and it will lead you to a link directly to the Cover MS landing page where you can register, sign in, and share your experiences with your symptoms as well as your MS symptoms as well.
Well, I want to thank you, Dr. Briggs, for leading this important work and for being with us today.
Very happy to share these results with you and everyone else.
Before we continue our discussion, I'd like to welcome those of you who have continued to join us. Please let us know what's on your mind. Type your questions into the question or chat box on GoToWebinar. MS navigators are online throughout today's program, answering those questions and connecting you to resources. Our Ask an MS Expert program takes place at this same time every Friday. So please help us make sure that everyone knows about it by sharing news about the webcast with your family and your friends. I'd like to also remind our viewers that COVID-19 is a new coronavirus, and the published data available about this virus and MS are limited. The information and recommendations presented in this program are based upon individual professional opinion of MS experts and the evidence currently available about MS, COVID-19, vaccines, and disease-modifying therapies. The information that is shared does not substitute for your healthcare provider's recommendations. Please check with your healthcare provider before making any changes to your treatment plan. We've seen that experts are learning about COVID-19 in real time, and new information about the virus seems to be in the news almost every day. Today, we'd like to share some facts that you can rely on in making the best decisions for yourself and your loved ones. And to do that, I'd like to invite Dr. Amit Bar-Or to join us. Thank you for being with us today, Dr. Bar-Or.
Hi, John. It's a pleasure.
You're part of the group of experts that the National MS Society has convened to develop guidance for people living with MS when it comes to making decisions about the safety and timing of COVID-19 vaccines with certain DMTs. We've been talking about this for several months, but I think it's beneficial to once again ask the same question. Are the COVID-19 vaccines from Pfizer BioNTech, Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson safe for people with MS? And should people with MS be vaccinated against COVID-19?
So the short answers to those, John, are yes and yes. We know from the large studies that these vaccines are generally viewed as quite safe, and certainly no less safe than prior vaccines that we've been using for many years in the general population. There is no reason to think that individuals with MS will find any of these vaccines less safe. There, of course, has been discussion about the possibility of any one of these vaccines, as with prior vaccines, inducing MS activity. And prior studies that had looked at vaccines and the limited data that we have to date certainly do not indicate any additional increased risk for individuals with MS in relation to these vaccines, for any of the complications that we've seen in the general population, or for any MS-related type complications. And the general recommendation is indeed that people living with MS should be vaccinated with whichever of these vaccines they have access to.
In fact, the MS Society has shared specific guidance about COVID-19 vaccinations for people on the various MS disease-modifying therapies. Now, most disease-modifying therapies aren't expected to affect someone's response to the COVID-19 vaccines, though there are some that may make the vaccines less effective. What are some of the disease-modifying therapies that may impact vaccine effectiveness?
So first, it's important to know that the question is indeed about whether the vaccine will have a limited efficacy, not a question of safety. In other words, there's no real safety consideration in terms of getting vaccinated on any of the MS DMTs. And the question then is whether certain DMTs would limit the immune system's response in terms of its ability to mount the maximal vaccine response. And while I'll refer people to the NMSS website for the particulars, the general categories of medications used in the MS world that may limit the maximal response to the vaccine will include those that limit the trafficking of cells from the lymphoid tissue to mobilize to where they need to respond to the vaccine, as well as those medications that deplete cells or that limit the ability of the immune cells to get activated properly when the vaccine is administered.
Is it important to coordinate the timing of getting one of these approved vaccines, with the timing of disease-modifying therapies to provide the best possible vaccine response?
It's an excellent question. And the answer is that, yes, it depends on the DMT, but for some DMTs, there is value in thinking about the timing. For example, with B-cell depleting therapy that is used by infusion every 6 months, Ocrevus, the question is, when do you need your B cells around to mount the best vaccine response? So first of all, an important fundamental point about vaccines is that when anybody gets a vaccine, different cells of the immune system will interact with one another, and this, over a course of a couple of weeks, will mount the maximal response and generate the subsequent profile of immune cells and factors that can respond to the infection robustly. And in people who are not on any medication, about 2 weeks is sufficient for them to mount this response. And the people who are starting a medicine such as Ocrevus should wait at least a couple of weeks like anybody else before starting their Ocrevus. If, however, they are on a medicine like Ocrevus, then the important question is, when might you want to time the subsequent infusion of the Ocrevus so as to, on one hand, get the most benefit of some of the B cells that come back before you remove them again, so that they can participate in the most robust immune response. So that's one issue of timing, that you would like to delay, if you can, the vaccination, or when we'll talk about boosters, the booster to enough months after the last infusion. And we now recommend at least 3 months if possible, but up to 5 months after the last infusion. So if you're getting the 2 initial shots, you will still have enough time before the next infusion. So 4 weeks from the vaccine to the next infusion is the ideal timing with respect to the 6 monthly administered medicines.
You and your colleagues at Penn conducted a study of the immune response following COVID-19 vaccinations in people with MS on B-cell depleting therapies like Ocrevus or Rituxan. Another study was conducted at Johns Hopkins, and that study had similar findings to yours. So what are you and others in the scientific community learning?
So, and in fact, there have been already 3 additional papers in the literature on the same topic, looking in particular at what happens to vaccine responses in individuals on the anti-CD20 therapies. And the answer is, first of all, as I'd mentioned, it is worth timing the vaccine if you can, so that you have the opportunity to mount the best antibody response. We have learned, and this is not surprising at all, that people on this type of therapy will have very attenuated or sometimes even absent antibody responses. That's not at all a surprise, because the cells that are responsible for making antibodies are the B cells of the immune system, and those are the cells that are, of course, removed with these anti-CD20 therapies. But the other important thing that we've learned is that the immune system response, as we've known, mounts different types of responses to vaccine, and the antibody response, which is the easiest one to measure, is only one of the responses that's relevant for protection. The other aspect of the immune system response that is relevant for protection are the cellular immune responses, particularly of T cells of the immune system, including those very cells that are critical to be able to identify and get rid of virally infected cells in the body. And when we and others have looked at the T cell responses to the vaccine, the same patients who may have attenuated or even absent antibody responses actually mount very robust T cell responses. And in some cases, their T cell responses are even more robust than the T cell responses in people who are not on anti-CD20, individuals who do not have MS and are on no therapy. And those responses that are mounted are indeed the very ones that we think of as relevant for immune protection. They're the ones that are the best antiviral responders of the immune system.
So in terms of protection for people living with MS, once they're fully vaccinated, are they protected against COVID-19 infection? So
there, I would make the point that it depends on what one means by protection, right? And this is a very interesting sociological phenomena where we need to think about what we're defining as the bar for protection. First of all, any vaccine, even the most effective one, doesn't protect you from exposure. So you may be vaccinated and fully protected from bad infection, but if you're exposed, you'll be exposed. Some viral particles will get into your airway, perhaps into your lungs, but your immune system will be able to mount a response. And in many people, as we know, even without vaccine, they may be asymptomatic. And the most important thing about an effective vaccination from the standpoint of protection is to protect people from serious outcomes and death. Because in fact, if COVID-19 and SARS-CoV-2 resulted in a moderate flu and nothing more than that, we would for the most part be shrugging our shoulders and calling it a not great flu season. We would not be referring to it as a pandemic. And the issue with SARS-CoV-2 and COVID, of course, is that a lot of people do get seriously ill and potentially die, and that's what the vaccines are really meant to protect us from. So the question of whether people who do get fully vaccinated are protected, all the vaccines that have been approved are highly effective at limiting people from developing serious complications of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, serious COVID complications and death, and they substantially decrease the risk of people developing any symptoms at all. But as the vaccine wanes, and in some people, even with the vaccine, first of all, exposure is not prevented, and some people may end up being symptomatic, but they're much more likely to develop a mild cold-like symptom and not a serious infection.
Is there a way to measure how much T-cell response a person might have?
So there are some companies out there now that are referring to T-cell measurements to vaccine response or the natural infection. These are early days. It's still, even with the antibodies that are commonly available, not so easy at times to interpret what the numbers mean and different reference ranges and so on. And the days are particularly early for T-cell measurements. There's a lot of interest in being able to do enough of these in well-characterized cohorts to understand which of these measurements actually associates with protection and which may develop as responses but are not necessarily part of the protection. We don't yet have that data. So there are such assays that are being now increasingly made available for people, but it's too early days in my view to be able to interpret those results meaningfully, certainly at the level of individual patients.
I heard you mention the possibility of having an attenuated or absent antibody response, and I think you've answered a lot of the points of this next question that we received from one of our viewers, but it's a common question, and I think it's probably worth focusing on for a moment. We heard from Jason, he's on Ocrevus, and Jason said his doctor ordered a COVID-19 antibody test 4 weeks after receiving his second dose of the Pfizer vaccine. Those results indicated that Jason had undetectable antibody levels, and Jason wants to know, what does this really mean for him?
Exactly. So again, for Jason, the lack of measuring antibodies in this context is not at all surprising, because again, the B cells are responsible for making those, and with the depletion, they're not available to make new antibodies. The important point again is that the immune system has these multiple limbs of response, and the T-cell responses that were mounted when you got the vaccine are almost certainly mounted at a level that is pretty much indistinguishable from someone who would not be on the Ocrevus. So the T-cell limb of your immune system, unless there are other issues that may compromise the immune system, should be mounted in a way that history would tell us from any other infection we've studied with these types of T-cell responses would confer protection. We still need to get data from larger numbers of people to correlate the T-cell responses with the protection. But again, we do have some information, for instance, from the cancer field, where when people do generate these cells, these are cells within your CD8 T-cell compartment. Those CD8 T-cells to the virus, when they develop, have been shown in the cancer world to protect people from bad infection as well as mortality from the infection.
So it seems as though getting one of these antibody tests, even after someone's been fully vaccinated, may not be the complete measure of whether they will mount a healthy response to COVID-19.
That's right, John. And in fact, we have not been recommending that people go and get antibody testing, particularly in the context of these types of therapies, because it's really not meaningful in terms of the interpretation.
The FDA has approved the use of an additional dose of the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine for certain immunocompromised individuals. Now, does having MS mean that a person is immunocompromised?
No, so having MS per se in no way compromises a person's immune system. We think that people with MS have an immune system that for the most part is working perfectly well. Some aspects are working perhaps a little too well, you might say, where the immune system sort of gets confused and reacts against the central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord. Those are the MS attacks. But there's no reason to think that people living with MS have a compromised immune system based on having MS.
So when we're talking about this additional dose and its implications for people living with MS, who should get a third dose and when should they get it?
So the third dose is brought up in the context of providing people with an opportunity to mount a better response than they have gotten. In other words, if they have an adequate response to the initial full vaccination regimen, that's the context in which a third dose is considered. And people who are immune compromised, people who, for instance, in the world of cancer are on certain cancer therapies, or people who are in a transplant, post-transplant setting, receiving certain immune suppressants, and other individuals with chronic immune suppression, such as with some autoimmune diseases, patients on chronic steroids or other medications, those individuals would be viewed as immune compromised. And for them, a third dose, which can be given 28 days or more after the completion of the full regimen of either the Pfizer BioNTech or the Moderna, would be viewed as appropriate to try to help them mount a better immune response than they would in their immune compromised state.
Can people mix and match the vaccines, or does the third dose have to be the same brand of vaccine that that person originally received?
So it doesn't have to be the same. This is a question where we have some data, but more data will be coming out, and it's relevant both in the context of this third shot to help immune compromised individuals, but also when we refer to boosters. And the study of those same following the initial, in other words, if you get Pfizer having received Pfizer or Moderna having received Moderna, that is referred to as homologous boosting or homologous third dose, as opposed to changing from the RNA vaccine platform to the viral vector vaccine or the other way around, and that is referred to as heterologous. And so we have some data on both, although it's relatively limited. At the moment, there's no reason to say one is clearly better than the other, but both appear to be quite effective in elevating the immune response when two shots were found not to be sufficient.
You and your colleagues are leading another study that's being funded by the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, which is part of the NIH. And this study is looking at the antibody response to that extra dose of an authorized or approved COVID-19 vaccine in people with autoimmune disease who did not respond to an original COVID-19 vaccine regimen. What's the goal of this study and why is it important?
Well, in part, it will address some of the questions that we just referred to. We want to understand how people across several autoimmune conditions, including multiple sclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, skin condition called pemphigus, and others, how their vaccine response can be augmented if it is found not to be sufficient after completing an initial regimen. So people have the test that is used out there now commercially to measure antibodies, and when found to be absent or too low, they would be eligible to get a third shot. We are starting this with the same, meaning the homologous regimen, and we will learn whether one can get quantification both for the antibody responses, but also for the cellular responses that we had mentioned before as being an important limb of the effective immune response. And we will learn through this study whether the booster, the timing of that third shot, will indeed augment the immune response as one would hope. This is an adaptive trial design, which is important, and what that means that it allows us to, once we've collected sufficient information to ask one question, to seamlessly then add perhaps another limb to the study, different patients with a different condition, or patients on different immune therapies, to continue to add questions and answers as this adaptive trial moves forward.
And when can we anticipate seeing results from this study?
We hope to have the first results from this homologous vaccine response study within probably 4 to 5 months. So perhaps beginning of 2022 would be an opportunity to share the initial results that come out, and those will also be guiding us in terms of the adaptive design and what then are the next important questions to address.
We heard from Cheryl, who wonders if everyone who gets an additional vaccine dose will develop more antibodies against COVID-19.
Well, so in general, people who are not in an immune therapy that limits their ability to mount the antibodies ought to be able to develop additional antibodies. It's not necessarily the case that everyone needs to have additional doses and additional induction of antibodies, but the way that the immune system works is that it develops the initial antibody response, and with subsequent exposures that can be boosted. There tends to be a natural decline in the antibodies in the circulation. An important point, though, there is that the cells that are developed as part of a complete vaccine response and confirm memory to the vaccine and the bug, those are not circulating as much as they're residing in the tissues and waiting there for the subsequent exposure. And when there is a subsequent exposure, whether it's the natural infection or another shot of the vaccine, they mobilize and mount a very efficient memory immune response, including antibodies. So even the absence of antibodies in the circulation does not necessarily mean that people are not protected. And those who received good vaccines initially will be able to mount very effective and protective vaccine responses with subsequent exposure.
Dana wrote in saying she had some side effects after getting her second dose of the vaccine. Should people who experience side effects with the first or second vaccine dose get that third dose? And should they expect side effects from the third dose?
So you heard a very nice presentation before by Farren, who described some of the profiles of side effects with the different vaccine shots. And there, on the average, may be an increase in side effects across the exposures. That certainly makes sense theoretically for some of the experience, but we have actually seen, and this has been the report by many others, that there are those who have had no side effects with the initial and then have some with subsequent, and vice versa. People who had side effects with the initial and actually have lesser with the subsequent ones. The other that people have asked is whether the degree of the side effects relates or correlates with the extent of protection, and that also is not something that is readily borne out. So the side effects, what I tell people is that it's hard to know whether you will or will not. For the most part, the side effects tend to be mild to moderate across broad populations. Every once in a while, someone might have more severe side effects, but we have certainly seen, and after encouraging individuals who had fairly substantial side effects with any given shot to continue and complete the regimen, and those people ended up coming back and saying, you know what, it was not nearly as bad as I'd thought.
We've already talked about the importance of timing receiving the COVID-19 vaccine with some DNTs. Does the timing for that third dose matter as well?
Well, the considerations and probably sort of the rules around thinking about timing of an additional dose or booster would be similar to those around the initial vaccination. Really, the idea is the same, that if you could time, whether it's the initial regimen or the third dose or booster, to when your immune system is most available to give its maximal response, then it's advisable to do so. And the timing of the boosters, once people have been vaccinated, where the goal is really to boost as opposed to establish the initial, there may be a greater deal of flexibility there. And some of the studies, including the one that you referred to previously that we are involved in, will be looking at adjusting timing of boosters relative to the immune therapy. In some cases, taking a pause on some of the immune therapies to see whether that will enable the immune system to mount a better response to the boosters is another question that we will be addressing.
We heard from Amelia, who shares that she's on a B-cell depleting therapy, and she received the J&J vaccine. Amelia wants to know whether she can receive an additional dose of this vaccine.
So for those individuals, as they are getting their initial regimen of vaccination, and getting 2 shots with the RNA vaccines or a single shot with the J&J, there is the opportunity to get another shot. And again, it is probably not that important to get the same one, and there may even be advantages in getting a different one. So if there's an issue and a concern over not mounting the full response, getting whether the same or a heterologous one, in this case an RNA vaccine, is something that could be considered as well.
Well, let's get to some of the latest news about the COVID-19 booster. The FDA just authorized the booster dose of the Pfizer COVID-19 vaccine for certain populations. Who's eligible to receive this booster?
So the news flash uses particular language, and they refer to people who should get the vaccine and people who may get the vaccine. And so those individuals who they advise should get the booster, which would be the Pfizer booster, would be any individual over the age of 65, people who reside in long-term facility settings, and then people who are ages 50 to 64 who have an underlying medical condition that puts them at higher risk of severe infection. And these conditions include a range that are listed on the website and will be available on the National MS Society. That information, I understand, has just been added to the National MS Society. But these are individuals who have various chronic conditions, chronic lung conditions, kidney conditions, are on immune compromising medications and so on. So those individuals in that age range of 50 to 64 who are on the, who basically are also with an underlying medical condition or a therapy that compromises their immune response, are advised that they should get the booster. For those individuals who are between the ages of 18 and 49 who have an underlying medical condition, this is a group where the language refers to they may receive a booster. And by the way, in all cases, and this is different from that 3rd shot that can be given 28 days or more after the full vaccination, in all cases, the booster is administered at least 6 months after the completion of the regimen, because again, the idea of the booster here is not so much to augment an immune compromised response in individuals who did not mount a full response to the original vaccination regimen. The booster concept is that when the vaccine response wanes over time, as it does for the majority of vaccines out there, one might want to receive the booster, and again, for this type of population. The 18 to 64 individuals who are at increased risk for COVID exposure and transmission because of what they do, so healthcare professionals or teachers, are also in a category that is indicated as may receive a booster, again, 6 months after their initial Pfizer-BioNTech regimen.
So is someone who may be living with MS but doesn't have another medical condition as well, and they aren't on one of the B-cell depleting medications, are they A, at high risk, and B, eligible for a booster?
So the one thing that some individuals with MS who may not be on a medicine that compromises their immune system, or may not have one of these other medical conditions, or as we refer to them as comorbidities, would be individuals who have a higher degree of disability. The rationale for these categories per the CDC and the FDA is to consider augmenting the immune response in those individuals in the population who are at greater risk of developing severe COVID, severe complications, including risk of death. And so for the most part, people with MS, one would think of just as you would with the general population. And the one thing that individuals with MS may have that other people would not is a degree of disability. And if disabled, that has been associated with increased risk of more severe outcomes of COVID and could be viewed under that category.
I'll ask you to get out your crystal ball for a moment. I'm wondering if you think there eventually will be a booster available for the general population and not just people who may be at high risk for severe COVID-19.
So I think that's a really interesting question, John. As you know, there's been discussion about getting additional vaccines in one context when there are other contexts where people have not gotten any. either because of vaccine hesitancy or because of access. And where does society put the effort into protecting individuals, but also protecting society by protecting more and more individuals. And I think that this will amount to discussions that are ongoing at multiple levels of the administration, the CDC and the FDA, because the questions again are going to be, what are we trying to protect from? Are we trying to protect people from developing any symptom of infection at all, or are we okay with people having mild symptoms as long as they're protected and others around them are protected from serious complications and death? So I think that the place that boosters will find in society will depend on the outcomes of these discussions. And also it's important to keep in mind historically that the great majority of vaccines, as I had mentioned before, do wane in their response over time. We know that there are boosters in the context of other vaccines, such as tetanus toxoid, for example. So it would not be a surprise if this is viewed as something that does require some boosting of vaccination in the general population, but certainly in terms of a staged rollout and identifying those first at higher risk and then intermediate risk seems to be a very sensible approach.
Bob received the Moderna vaccine and his wife Patty received the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. Now, both of them are over 65 years old. Can both Bob and Patty receive a booster?
Well, at the moment, it's only the Pfizer-BioNTech that is receiving these recommendations, but there are active discussions relating to both the Moderna and the J&J, and one would hope that we will hear about those and have additional updates to provide for boosters in that context within, we hope, the next few months.
Well, preventing infections through vaccination has been a fundamental part of healthcare in America ever since George Washington issued a mandate for soldiers in the Continental Army to be vaccinated against smallpox. And preventing infections through vaccination is a key part of medical care for people living with MS. Experts from the American Academy of Neurology recommend that people with MS receive vaccines according to standard vaccine guidelines. Flu season will be here soon. So let's spend a moment talking about that seasonal flu vaccination. Should people living with MS get a flu shot every year?
So the general recommendation in this regard, again, is that people living with MS should be thinking about it as though they're not living with MS. And anyone whose general medical condition or physicians consider them to be candidates for the flu vaccine, which in many people's mind is everybody out there, would be eligible and ought to receive it.
We've heard from Albert, who wants to know if he can get the flu vaccine and the COVID-19 vaccine at the same time.
So the answer is it's probably okay in the sense that it's relatively unlikely that one will interfere with the immune response to the other. There's a theoretical consideration that might happen, but most studies with other combinations of vaccines have not shown that. And of course, as you know, in the pediatric population, we commonly give several at the same time. But a reason to consider going twice if you can is that if you were to have some side effect from one, it wouldn't be confused with the other. And so getting the flu and the COVID vaccine shots a couple of weeks apart, if practical, may be the way to go. But if it turns out that both are available or only available around the same time, then that should probably be okay.
Should someone who has either suspected or even confirmed COVID-19, should they be getting a flu vaccine?
Well, in general, we tend to advocate that people not get vaccinated if they're actively infected with any infection. But if someone has a history of having had COVID-19, there's no contraindication or no reason for them not to be offered the flu vaccine.
Well, you've shared a lot of important and very timely information with us today. What would you say are the top 3 takeaways that you'd like our audience to remember?
So, John, I think first and foremost, SARS-CoV-2 and COVID has emerged as a very serious pandemic, and vaccinations protect from infections, including the SARS-CoV-2 and COVID. And People ought to get vaccinated to protect themselves, their loved ones, and people around them. People with MS in general can think of themselves as no different from the general population when it comes to risks from the infection. They're no more protected from SARS-CoV-2 or COVID complications than the general population. The imperative to getting vaccinated is no less, and in some cases more, and certainly in individuals who are on disease-modifying therapies that can impact the immune system. There's no issue of safety, as far as we can tell, either with people with MS and the vaccines or the combination of MS and disease-modifying therapies and vaccine. And finally, the immune response is involving several different limbs that are going to confer protection. And depending on the therapy that you're on, the measurements that are available and some of the future measurements need to be taken with the understanding that they may not be reporting on the full range of the important aspects of the vaccine response. In the particular case we highlighted today is the issue of measuring antibodies in the context of the anti-CD20 therapies, where it is not surprising at all that they would be absent or very attenuated, and we therefore do not recommend people go out and routinely test for them. But the good news is, and we hope to have additional news that will give us a better sense of the degree of protection, that individuals such as those on anti-CD20, and even in the face of not mounting antibodies, will mount very robust T-cell responses that we think will protect them from serious infection and serious complications of COVID.
Well, thank you, Dr. Bar-Or, for sharing your expertise on these topics. We have time to continue answering more questions from our viewers. Emily wrote in saying that she's 22 years old, she's living with MS, and she's recovered from a mild case of COVID-19. Emily wants to know if she still needs to get vaccinated.
Hi, Emily. Yes, the answer is yes, that while being exposed to an infection does induce an immune response that can confer a degree of protection, the protection from the natural infection is likely not to be as good as the protection from the vaccination. And the vaccination is going to do an overall more robust job, particularly at generating those aspects of your immune response that will confer memory, the stronger memory for subsequent exposure. And subsequent exposure can actually cover some of the variants as well, and that becomes important in terms of longer term and more robust protection. So having had an infection does not mean no need for vaccine.
Sophia wants to know if once you're vaccinated, are you still at risk of spreading COVID-19 to others?
That's an excellent question again. And so of the different immune responses to a vaccine, the antibody response does a particularly good job at clearing virus if it has not yet entered the cells. So if you have virus that comes in and then gets into the bloodstream, antibodies that are there will neutralize the virus quickly, which means that it allows you to develop what's called sterile immunity quite quickly. And in doing so, you will not be shedding the virus and will not likely be infecting others. If, however, you don't have the antibodies, but you have the cellular response, you will be able to prevent cells from spreading infection by targeting those that are already infected and be protected from serious outcomes, as we were saying before. But in the absence of antibodies, you may not get rid of the virus as quickly, and you may therefore be a carrier of the virus for a little bit longer. How much longer, we don't actually know. But the point being that most individuals who are fully vaccinated would be viewed as having a very low likelihood of spreading the virus, at least not in large quantities, and quantity and degree of exposure appear to matter. If, however, you are, for instance, on an immune therapy like the anti-CD20s that limit the antibody response, while your cellular response may protect you adequately, one of the considerations is that you may not sterilize your antiviral response as quickly, and you may be therefore a carrier for a little bit longer. For such individuals, we recommend that they continue to practice precautions with masking, with social distancing, and frequent hand washing when they are around people who themselves are not vaccinated, or if you're not sure about the people around you.
Carl wrote in, and he says that he's read lots of social media posts that say that vaccines carry unhealthy additives. And he wanted to take this opportunity to ask an expert about that. So are there unhealthy additives in vaccines?
So thanks for that question, Carl. That question indeed comes up. There are, the simple answer is that no, there are no unhealthy additives sort of as a category in vaccines. Vaccines, of course, those that have been approved, and even though this is an emergency approval, there have been tens of thousands of individuals exposed to the vaccine, and there is no reason to think that there are particular unhealthy side effects or additives involved in the vaccines. There are some individuals who may be allergic to some components of vaccines, and it depends on the type of vaccine, and these are individuals who are advised to have discussions with their healthcare professionals and perhaps avoid one type of vaccine or another. The question of any therapy that gets out there and the potential for unhealthy aspects is one that we do need to keep in our minds moving forward. There is always an opportunity to learn more, and I don't think that we've learned everything there is to learn, but I would not view these vaccines as having unhealthy additives as such.
Well, I want to thank everyone who submitted great questions today, and thank you, Dr. Bar-Or, for being with us today.
It's been a pleasure, John. Thank you.
I think that one of the best things that anyone can do for themselves, especially during these uncertain times, is to make sure that the information they're getting is credible and reliable. So we'd like to share some resources with you, and these are resources that you can count on to be current and credible. To learn more about COVID-19 and vaccinations, please visit the National MS Society's website at nationalms-society.org/coronavirus-COVID-19-information. I want to remind you that the National MS Society's MS Navigator team is your best partner when it comes to connecting you to the very best information and resources on living with MS. You can reach an MS Navigator by phone, email, or through the Society's website by chat. I'll also remind you that the MS Society brings people together through peer connection programs like self-help groups, the MS Friends Helpline and Paired Program, and the National MS Society Facebook community. To learn more, please visit the Society's website at nationalmssociety.org/connectionsprograms. Every week on the Real Talk MS podcast, I continue the conversation that we start here. So I hope you'll take a few minutes and give Real Talk MS a listen. You'll find the Real Talk MS podcast at realtalkms.com, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, or wherever you find your favorite podcasts. Don't just ride, bike MS. Bike MS is more than the ride of a lifetime. Whether you want to cross a finish line in person or take on a new challenge from anywhere, there's a Bike MS event that's right for you. Find out more and be sure to register at bikems.org. You can connect with the National MS Society along with others affected by MS on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I encourage you to like the posts, subscribe to the channels, and make sure that you're on the Society's mailing list so you'll continue to receive the latest information on MS and updates on upcoming programs like this one. I'd like to thank Dr. Amit Bar-Or and Dr. Farren Briggs for joining us today. Please remember that a recording of this webinar will be available at the Society's website at nationalmssociety.org/msexpert, as well as on Facebook and YouTube. I hope you'll join us again for next week's edition of Ask an MS Expert. And beginning next week, Ask an MS Expert will come to you in a more convenient 30-minute block of time. You can always find our upcoming program topics on the National MS Society's website. Finally, I have a favor to ask each of you. Getting your feedback on today's webinar is important. So you'll see a survey pop up in a moment when we close out the webinar. And if you're watching on Facebook Live, you'll see a link to that survey pinned in the comments section. And on YouTube, you'll find that link in the program description. Completing the survey makes a real difference. The information you provide helps us continuously improve, and it helps shape future webinars. The survey takes just 1 minute, so I hope you'll take a minute to fill it out. On behalf of Dr. Amit Bar-Or, Dr. Farren Briggs, and the National MS Society, I want to thank you once again for joining us. Please stay safe and make healthy choices.